Welcome to this presentation on the UN SEEA Experimental Ecosystem Accounts. My name is Daniel Clarke. I am a UN statistician and currently visiting researcher at the Gunn Institute for Ecological Economics. The Experimental Ecosystem Accounts is part of a suite of guidelines under the banner of the SEEA, or System of Environmental Economic Accounts. It's called experimental because some aspects of this framework that I'm about to present are still considered under development, and because pilot studies of this framework in a variety of contexts is highly encouraged. Okay, so a good starting point for this is to review the relationship between natural processes and the production boundary, or the definition of production as defined by the System of National Accounts, the SNA. So the first bullet point in this slide is the definition of production according to the SNA. Now, certain natural processes or their benefits are at least implicitly accounted for under this production boundary only if they meet this criteria, and some natural processes will meet this criteria, others won't. So for example, the growth of fish population out in a lake or in the ocean may have some sort of implicit economic value as a source of protein, or eventually ending up as a part of an economic good, but this will not be included as part of within the scope of the production boundary, because it is outside it doesn't meet this criteria of the control and responsibility and instigation of an institutional unit, which, by the way, according to the SNA, are households, government units, and businesses or enterprises. On the other hand, fish population growth, or the growth of stock of fish on a fish farm, does meet this criteria, and so that process does fall implicitly within the scope of the production. So the analysis of trade-offs involving any of these benefits that don't meet the criteria, like the fish out in the lake or in the ocean, or the growth of trees in a forest that is part of the public lands or not part of the work of a timber plantation or other type of forest plantation, are not included within this framework, and thus the trade-offs for involving such benefits can't be assessed from the national account statistics that we have currently. And so in part, the aim for the experimental ecosystem accounts is to address this problem of not being able to assess these trade-offs, or effectively a limitation of the scope of the national accounts as it's currently defined. So we do this by trying to account for ecosystem services, which are defined as contributions of ecosystems to benefits used in economic and other human activity. Now, as I mentioned, some of these contributions may already fit, at least implicitly, although they're not explicitly identified, within the scope of the SNA production. Other types of these benefits or contributions are beyond the scope of SNA production, and we want to try to account for these contributions as well in the experimental ecosystem accounts. So to give a quick idea of where we're trying to head, is to try to produce, for example, resource depletion adjusted net domestic product. So a measure of the net production of an economy adjusted for the depletion of the natural resources. That comes from the natural resource accounting, or central framework accounting under the SEEA, and then also an ecosystem degradation adjusted NDP, which could in principle be derived by producing the experimental ecosystem accounts. And so the objective, again, expand the scope of the current national accounting framework towards integrated measures of flows of the ecosystem services and their benefits, and the stocks and changes to stocks of so-called ecosystem assets, including particularly one particularly important change in stock of ecosystem assets, which is the ecosystem degradation. And the ecosystem degradation, or the definition of the ecosystem assets, or how they are measured, depends very much on the identification of the ecosystem services and their benefits. So in that sense, ecosystem services and their benefits identification is the starting point. But in this presentation, I'll describe the ecosystem asset accounting first. One final way to describe in general the framework is to first show here this picture of the general framework for the SEEA resource accounting portion, what's called the central framework of the SEEA. In this framework, you have the activities going on within the economy between the different institutional units A and B in this graph within the boundaries of the SNA. Coming into those relationships, you have material inputs from the environment, all types of natural resources that exist in the environment, flowing within to these SNA activities, the flows between the institutional units in the SNA. Then you also have returns, or the residuals, the waste and emissions, all the types of residuals from the economy that flow back into the environment. And then you also have the changes in the stocks of environmental assets, which are the stocks of natural resources, essentially. The same framework applies, just expanded, for the experimental ecosystem account. So you still have the activity going on the left-hand side within the sphere of the economy. We still have the material inputs, but we expand that to include a broader scope of inputs, which are the ecosystem services. Of course, you still have returns going back towards the environment, and then we identify, and this is the crucial point for the asset accounting, functional units representing ecosystems within the environment, which are X and Y in this diagram, and then we want to identify changes to stocks of ecosystem assets, or effectively the changes in the condition or the capacity of those assets. So not only the changes in the stocks of natural resources as what is accounted for in the central framework. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity provides a definition for ecosystems, which is indeterminate of spatial scale. So the SEEA defines ecosystems assets as non-overlapping spatial areas, and the aim in the ecosystem asset accounting is to assess the condition of those spatial areas, in terms of how they are functioning, the quality of their processes, etc., with respect to flows of ecosystem services from that ecosystem to economic and human activity. So in principle, the changes in these conditions should be reflected in changes to ecosystem services, or expected flows of ecosystem services. And this is just to show this basic generic asset account, what it looks like for natural resources. For example, you have additions to stock of different varieties. You have reduction of stock of different varieties, including the extraction, so the direct removal by humans through some production process of those assets. And then you have from there you can derive the closing stock of environmental assets, and also by looking at some of the additions and looking at the removals or the reductions in the stock caused by human activity, the depletion of those assets, or for the case of ecosystem accounting, the degradation to ecosystem assets. This is what we're trying to derive roughly for the different types of ecosystem asset accounts, and I'll run through some examples. Here's an example of non-overlapping spatial areas, so these could be considered ecosystems or ecosystem assets. For the case of Vermont, these are the areas of the river basins or drainage basins within the state of Vermont. And here are also non-overlapping spatial boundaries. These are the towns, for which we already have different types of data on population, data on the economy, other types of data for these non-overlapping spatial areas. But what we want to identify not only is the non-overlapping spatial areas, but spatial areas that represent functional units providing these ecosystem services. And so the river basins, the drainage basins in the previous slide seem to me much more suitable as the ecosystem assets for the state of Vermont, or the functional units, perhaps combined with some other information such as these administrative boundaries or land use, land cover data. And the idea is we layer all of this information, including the population and economic data and all of the different type of information on environmental on ecosystem assets that I'm about to describe, for those non-overlapping spatial areas for the asset. So I'll run through the example of Mauritius. A good place to start for, or the really necessary place to start for ecosystem accounting, is to describe the land cover of the territory that you are producing the accounts for. So here's the land cover map for the country of Mauritius. Mauritius is an island nation in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. Two of their big industries are tourism. It's a tropical island in the Indian Ocean, and agriculture. Both of these industries are fairly big users of water, for example, and dependent on certain conditions of for the ecosystems on the island. So for these kinds of reasons, Statistics Mauritius was interested in producing these experimental asset accounts for the country, and they teamed up with the European Union to produce these accounts just last year. And I'm just going to use that as a quick example to run through a couple of the different types of ecosystem accounts. So the first type of account may be called a biocarbon asset account. In ecology, the same principles are sometimes referred to as the thermodynamics of ecosystems or the metabolism of ecosystems. Here we might just use the term the biocarbon asset account or carbon at capital account for these ecosystem assets, or for these non-overlapping spatial areas that make up the nation of Mauritius. And these are the river basins or the drainage basins for Mauritius, shown here, along with some information on the stocks of, in this slide, the woody biomass, the tons of carbon of biomass in the woody vegetation for each of those spatial areas. Then you have the additions to stock in all of our asset account. Here are some additions to stock in the form of net primary production, so the growth in the biomass, or the growth of the vegetation for across the country, which we can then distribute according to our non-overlapping spatial areas and apply as effectively the additions to stock for this asset account on the biocarbon. Then you have the removals or the reductions to stock. For example, sugarcane harvest. Sugarcane is one of the many major agricultural outputs for Mauritius. So these are effectively removals or reductions of the stock of biocarbon in each of those ecosystem assets, or in each of those spatial areas. You take your opening stock, your additions to stock, subtract the reductions to the stock that are caused by human activities or economic production, and you can arrive at your closing stock of assets for this thermodynamic or biocarbon account for the ecosystems of Mauritius, and thus derive for this component a measure of degradation for these ecosystems. Another example, accessible water. Again, you want to identify the stocks of accessible water by your river basins, or by your non-overlapping spatial areas or ecosystem assets, including the rivers and lakes and the precipitation and stocks of estimations for your stocks of groundwater or aquifers. reductions in stock, for example, water used for municipal purposes, used in the tourism sector, for example, or for irrigation, for the agriculture. These are effectively reductions in stock of the accessible water for those spatial units. And then you derive, in this way, you derive an accessible water account for each of those ecosystem assets. And again, the reductions in the stock caused by the human activities effectively become the measurements of your ecosystem degradation for that period. One last example is a biodiversity account, very, very crucial portion of the asset side or capital accounting side for the experimental ecosystem accounts. We have a definition, rather complex definition for biodiversity from the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. How to measure it? Well, fortunately we have many different types of measures, some of which already might be available or utilized within this system of asset accounting for the experimental ecosystem accounts in order to estimate or predict the biodiversity within those spatial areas. So for example, we know that biodiversity is linked to ecosystem extent, or put another way, the extent of contiguous light land cover. We know it's linked to net primary production, right? That's why biodiversity is greater in parts of the world with a higher net primary production. We know it's linked to the numbers of endemic species. We can derive information from certain keystone species. I like the example of the frogs because of a book I was reading by the biologist E.O. Wilson. He described frogs as a perfect indicator for the condition of ecosystems as functional units. He said that we couldn't have possibly designed a better indicator than frogs because of the fact that frogs spend their life cycles both in the water and on land in that ecosystem, and because they're prone to absorb and thus very sensitive to all kinds of changes in that ecosystem. So we have information on the population of frogs, the keystone species, different indicators like World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index. We have data on the red lists of threatened species all across the world, for all regions, in all countries, and in theory we can compile this kind of information, all these kinds of different types of information, also using other related information to derive a general measure of biodiversity for each of our ecosystem assets or for each of our spatial area and the territory we're looking at. This slide just to show that we're not talking about terrestrial areas only necessarily. Here's a map of some of the Pacific Islands east of New Zealand, and some information you can find on the internet on the condition of the reefs. Obviously very important ecosystems for the economies of the Pacific Islands. In principle, all of these reefs and all of these areas within the territorial boundaries of those countries also should be included within the ecosystem accounting for those countries. Now turning to the other side of the experimental ecosystem accounts, which is the flows of the benefits or the ecosystem services. I just wanted to mention another framework produced here in the United States by the Environment Protection Agency called the FEGS, or the Final Ecosystem Goods and Services. This framework was developed around the same time, or a little bit after the development of the UN experimental ecosystem accounts. And it's noteworthy that the general logic of both frameworks are for ecosystem services are more or less the same. Like with but with some small differences, which I will get to. The general approach for the FEGs, as with the experimental ecosystem accounts, is the importance of identifying the benefits to humanity, or the a beneficiary, and that's the idea of this picture, which I took from the FEGS publication, which is just to try to describe how you identify the beneficiaries in the population, the different type of benefits they may be deriving from the proximate ecosystems. So in terms of boundaries for how we define these ecosystem services, again, the logic as identified for the FEGs and for the experimental ecosystem accounts by the UN are generally the same. So for example, what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment originally called supporting services, or what some have also called intermediate services, such as photosynthesis, for example, or pollination, are part of the components of the ecosystem structure or its capacity, and thus is information highly relevant, I think, to the ecosystem asset accounts, as I described in the example of Mauritius, but not part of the ecosystem services, because the concept of ecosystem services is identified the final benefit to humanity. So for a good example of this is primary production, the growth of vegetation in the ecosystems. So for example, for a timber harvester or a hiker in the forest, this growth produces an ecosystem service or benefit. The recreational benefit by the hiker or the timber, in the case of the timber harvester. But those benefits are how we identify the ecosystem service, and the primary production itself is part of the condition of the ecosystem necessary to producing that service, but it's not the service itself. Now obviously, another interesting point about this example is obviously there is a trade-off between these two services, or between these two benefits, whether it's the timber harvester or the hiker. And so again, one of the purposes of bringing all this information into the scope of national accounting is so that we can actually make these trade-off decisions by having these different types of information integrated into one framework. So this is the logic for how the boundary for ecosystem service, as I said, both in the FEGs and in the UN experimental ecosystem accounts. But there are some boundary issues that are not exactly the same in the UN experimental ecosystem accounts as compared to the EPA's FEGs. So there is some lack of consensus in terms of the details and how this concept is implemented. So for example, I mentioned above a pollination, one of the supporting services in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is not included as an ecosystem service in the UN experimental ecosystem accounts, but in the FEGs, although they follow essentially the same logic of this final benefit to humanity, pollination is included within their list of ecosystem services. So some of the boundary cases, like pollination, we don't yet quite have a consensus on, apparently. Here's some diagrams taken from the FEGs. Very similar diagrams also appear in the UN experimental ecosystem accounts. It just shows that final ecosystem goods and services contribute in combination with labor and economic capital, and ultimately to providing some kind of human benefit. And the contribution of the economic sphere can vary from being almost negligible to quite important to the final benefit in the human sphere. So the similar kind of diagrams in the experimental ecosystem accounts look like this. Here's the example for carbon sequestration. You have the ecosystem service, in this case the net accumulation or net new capture of CO2 in that period. You have an enabling factor, which is the term used in the UN for basically identifying the benefit or the beneficiary, and then you have the benefit, which is the reduced impacts from climate change. Now in the FEGs, carbon sequestration is not included as an ecosystem service, again using that same logic I presented in the previous slide, but in the experimental ecosystem accounts, although the same or very similar logic is applied, carbon sequestration is included as one of the ecosystem services that we want to identify. Here's the example of flood protection, another ecosystem service with the benefit of reduced damages or reduced potential damages from different types of natural disasters. And the final example, I'll just show the diagram for filtration of air or different types of residuals, different types of returns from the economy to the environment that have to be absorbed by that ecosystem, and effectively this is a service to humanity that we benefit from. One of the classic cases or examples in the literature on ecosystem services, especially when it comes to valuation of ecosystem services, is the case of the Catskills region, the forests above, upstream from the New York City, which has for a long time provided these kind of water filtration services for the very large population of New York City. The drinking water for the population of New York City effectively comes from that region, from upstream in what's called the Catskills Ridge forests, up from New York City. And at some point, some years ago, the local authorities were considering investing in some new installations of sort of water filtration or water treatment plants for the city of New York, and of course the project was anticipated to be very, very, very expensive. And that was at this point they realized, well, a lot of the same kind of benefits we're thinking about actually can be provided to the residents of New York City at a much, much lower, almost negligible, not negligible, but much lower cost by simply maintaining the condition of the Catskills forest, the region up there, and allowing these ecosystems to provide these sort of water filtration services, benefits to the residents of New York in that way, and in this sense forego this very massive investment, very costly investment of building new water treatment plants and new water filtration plants for the drinking water of the New York City residents. So this was a concept that brought a lot of attention to the idea of evaluation of ecosystem services, but also created some criticism among economists who felt that, well, the way that we value goods and services currently in the economy is not that way. You cannot value the benefit of these Catskills water filtration services based on what would have been effectively the replacement cost or some kind of substitute service provided by this new infrastructure. That's not really the value of those services or the benefits. If you want to understand the value as we value goods and services in the accounts, you have to look at the exchange value concept. So returning very briefly to the basic microeconomics of exchange value, the way that we derive the value for goods and services in the other types of economic goods and services in the national accounts generally is based on the exchange value or the market price, derived, as you can see from the picture, from the intersection of the supply and demand for that service. As you can see, the area, the marginal value above the price, but below the demand curve, the triangle A is called the consumer surplus, additional sort of value, you can consider it, to the consumers in terms of their willingness to pay for that service, but not included in the actual valuation, because we'll actually use the market price P to value that good and service, which is the intersection between the supply and demand. Below the price P but above the supply is a triangle B, which is effectively the something like the profit or what's sometimes called the markup, above the cost of production for the supplier of that good or service, that's included within the price and the exchange value for that service. And the area C below the supply curve essentially represents the cost of production for that good and service. Now, when you look at it this way, the way that the economists like Rick, the question that comes to mind is, well, what could be that triangle B? We may be able to estimate the cost of production, even for ecosystem services. Although the ecosystemists don't ask for any kind of money, they effectively provide these services for free. There are costs involved. For example, in protecting the forest in the Catskills region above New York City. All of the costs associated with researching the condition of those and just generally protecting their condition or their capacity for providing those water filtration benefits would be included within the area C, the cost of the supply of the real costs of supply of those services or benefits. But since the ecosystem doesn't charge any price, they certainly don't charge any markup above the cost of production. So the triangle B, in that sense, essentially becomes negligible. And in fact, there is a precedent for this within the national accounts, which is the transfers in kind of services by government. Essentially, the services consumed by the population, which are provided effectively for free by the government. In this case, although the SNA describes it as the second best valuation approach, the approach that the SNA uses is just a cost of production approach. So just the value in the area C. So it follows to reason that for the case of ecosystem services, if we can at least identify the cost of production, the area C, so all the costs associated with protecting those ecosystems so that they are in a condition to provide those benefits, which, by the way, are costs that can be in themselves very, very considerable. At least those costs should be identified as the value, and perhaps, although this is certainly an item of fierce debate, perhaps in itself effectively the exchange value for those ecosystem services or benefits provided by the ecosystems. Now, in addition to this debate about how to go about valuing these ecosystem services that we've identified, there is also two perspectives on the significance of this valuation. So there's one school of thought that says that, well, this valuation part of the accounts is essential because we want to integrate the accounts and to make these trade-off choices. And so this the valuing questions should be a major priority. Others say, well, actually this whole system can be compiled in quote-unquote physical terms, and that in itself is very interesting and valuable for policy. So maybe we should just focus on producing accounts in physical terms and worry less about the challenges and debate about valuation. My opinion on this is a little bit different than both these perspectives. I do see the value, on the one hand, of producing the asset accounts, or the capital side of the accounts, as described for the example of Mauritius, in sort of quote-unquote physical terms. So in tons of carbon, volumes of water, measures of biodiversity. That certainly is valuable just as a framework for organizing this information and making this information available by the different spatial units. But the concept of ecosystem services is defined in the experimental ecosystem accounts and in some of the other literature, is that we're talking about the benefits and this intimate link to the beneficiaries, the human beneficiaries. And so for this reason, I don't think that it's sensible to think about measuring ecosystem services in any type of way other than as a value, probably a monetary value. Otherwise, I feel that other types of measurements of so-called ecosystem service is probably a confusion of the definition of ecosystem services as it is defined in this framework, in the experimental ecosystem accounts, as well as in the EPA's framework, the FEGS. The only real sensible measurement for those flows is some measure of value, because we're talking about benefits. And although, of course, in economics, the concept of value is one of the oldest and most complex debates imaginable, at least within the national accounts. The way we define a value is as a benefit. And so since we're effectively defining ecosystem services according to a benefit, what we're really talking about is value of some kind. And so the way to measure ecosystem services, it follows, is by some sort of value. And if we can produce some kind of value, some kind of agreed way of estimating that exchange value for the ecosystem services, then in principle we can link those values back to our ecosystem assets and the changes in the stocks of those ecosystem assets, and to the degradation of those ecosystem assets, and in that way have some kind of value in terms of the lost benefits for those degradations, in order to produce our NDP adjusted for ecosystem degradation. Two final points. Improved measurement happens by doing. So while I've shown that there is still some lacking consensus on some of the detailed boundary issues, and also on issues like the valuation of the ecosystem service, the only way to resolve these issues and resolve this debate and move things forward, in my opinion, is to start doing the measurement and producing the accounts, producing the measures, and I think new solutions and new ideas will reveal themselves that way. The main problem is not lack of data, as often presumed. In fact, there's enormous amounts of data all over the world, in all types of contexts, in all countries, that could be used for assessing the value of ecosystem services, or could be used for better understanding the condition or the capacity of the ecosystems within a country. And this data is grossly underused if it's lacking a clear conceptual framework in order to integrate the information together. And this is exactly what the experimental ecosystem accounts provides, is that conceptual framework for integrating all of this information. Thank you.